Hey everyone, and welcome back to my channel. Today, we're diving deep into a topic that's often misunderstood, sensationalized, and frankly, a bit oversimplified in popular culture and even in some scientific circles. The concept of disinhibition after brain injury. You've probably heard the story of Phineas Gage, the railroad worker who had an iron rod shoot through his head and supposedly became a completely different, wild, and impulsive person. It's a classic tale used to illustrate how frontal lobe damage can lead to a loss of self-control. But what if I told you that much of what we think we know about Phineas Gage is actually fiction? And what if there's another, equally compelling historical figure whose story has been largely ignored, precisely because it complicates this neat narrative? In this video, we're going to unpack the pervasive myth of disinhibition, challenge long-held assumptions, and explore two fascinating 19th century lives that reveal a much more nuanced and, frankly, more human understanding of brain injury and behavior. This isn't just about historical accuracy. It's about how these narratives impact real people today. So, buckle up, because we're about to open a window that some might have thought was painted shut. First, let's establish what disinhibition generally refers to in the context of brain injury. I spent nearly 2 decades working at Headway East London, a community center for brain injury survivors. During my time there, the organization adopted the language of neuropsychology, including concepts like disinhibition. So, what is it? Neuropsychology uses disinhibition to describe the impulsivity seen in people whose brain injuries have damaged their executive functions, those frontal lobe processes believed to keep humans on the straight and narrow. This can manifest in behaviors that challenge social expectations: swearing, unexpected sexual advances, sudden anger, crying, or laughing at inappropriate moments. Our clients would sometimes go missing, arrive with injuries, or upset others with tirades and unpredictable moods. Initially, we often used disinhibition as a way to mitigate challenging behaviors, to think creatively about how to help clients avoid trouble. However, there were times when it felt more like a condemnation. I even participated in processes to exclude individuals deemed too disinhibited to be safely included in the community. Looking back, I realize how broad and presumptive my use of the term became, having internalized it from journal articles, medical documents, and clinical conversations. The turning point for me came during a staff meeting with my colleague Callum, who is himself a brain injury survivor. He recounted an incident where a client, Yvette, made a derogatory comment about his sexuality. When I reflexively used the D word, disinhibition, Callum challenged me. He pointed out how reliant my use of the term was on cultural and moral assumptions, how it risked dehumanizing Yvette, and how it foreclosed other interpretations of her behavior. It was a revelation, like someone opening a window I thought was painted shut. This made me question everything. Had I been making my own life easier by reducing clients' motives to mere impulses, rather than investigating deeper reasons for their behavior? Where did this idea of disinhibition even come from? My research into the history of the term led me to suspect I might have fallen for a pseudo-scientific idea. While neuroscientists acknowledge that brain injury survivors can struggle with tests of attentional and motor control, there's surprisingly little evidence directly linking this executive disinhibition with the behavioral changes we attribute to social disinhibition. Instead, these theories often rely on specific case studies. And that brings us to the most famous case of all, Phineas Gage. In September 1848, Gage, a railroad foreman, had a tamping rod shot through his head in an explosion. Miraculously, he survived. His doctor, John Harlow, noted Gage's extraordinary recovery, but also described a profound personality change. From a shrewd, smart businessman to someone fitful, irreverent, indulging at times in the grossest profanity. Harlow famously concluded that Gage was no longer Gage, and attributed this decline to damage to his frontal lobes. The scientific significance of Gage's story truly took off in 1878, when Scottish neurologist David Ferrier used it in a lecture series. Ferrier popularized the idea of cerebral localization, mapping the brain's division into functional zones, and promoted the idea that frontal lobes inhibit physical activity for mental reflection. This laid the groundwork for terms like executive function and disinhibition in the 20th century. The core idea, hinted at by Harlow and stated plainly by Ferrier, was that the frontal lobes controlled animal passions that might disrupt ethical behavior, aligning with Freud's model of the id, ego, and superego. Gage became the poster child for this localization agenda. Even today, more than a century later, Gage's transformation is referenced as the quintessential case study. You'll find versions of his story on every page if you search for frontal lobe injury or executive functions online. Neuroscientists and cognitive neuroscientists have depicted him as someone who took to gambling and sleeping with prostitutes, could not be trusted, and began a new life of wandering. Antonio Damasio, in his widely translated book, Descartes' Error, described Gage's failure to secure steady work due to poor discipline, and his career as a circus attraction at Barnum's Museum, peddling misery for gold. Some accounts even call him extremely cruel or abusive. He's painted as an aggravated antisocial deviant. This sensational impact would be fine if it weren't for the fact that it's largely fictional. Here's where it gets critical. There are only 3 primary sources written about Gage by people who actually met him. John Harlow wrote his first report in 1848, focusing on recovery, and a second in 1868, which added interpretations. Another physician, Henry Bigelow, wrote a paper after meeting Gage in 1849. Of these, only Harlow mentions a personality change, and his total word count on the subject is just over 300 words. Crucially, he never quotes Gage or asks him about it. Gage was already dead when Harlow wrote the second paper. There are no surviving writings from anyone who knew Gage before his injury. According to psychologist and historian Malcolm Macmillan, most subsequent writers about Gage haven't bothered to check these primary sources, instead promoting some aspects, ignoring others, and embellishing liberally. A 2022 review confirmed this, finding that half of 25 analyzed papers presented negative descriptions of Gage not based on primary sources. Macmillan's simple test: if a description isn't quoted from the primary sources, it's not a fact about Phineas Gage. And the myths quickly pile up. Eagleman and Damasio's claims about Gage drinking, brawling, gambling, and visiting prostitutes? Not facts. Damasio's description of Gage working vaingloriously as a circus attraction? Also not a fact. The sources suggest he appeared at a museum, not a circus, and none detail how he presented himself. Hannah Damasio's claim that Gage began a new life of wandering seems to be an extrapolation from Harlow's single use of the word wanderings in the context of difficulty tracking Gage down later in life. Neither Harlow nor Bigelow suggested wandering was typical of his post-injury existence. Perhaps the most clearly contradicted falsehood is the Damasio's claim that Gage could not be trusted to honor his commitments and never return to a fully independent existence. The primary sources actually state that Gage was not dependent on anyone after his recovery until the last year of his life when he fell ill. In fact, after his public appearances, Gage worked at a livery stable for 18 months and then moved to Valparaiso, Chile, where he worked for nearly 8 years. Caring for horses and often driving a coach heavily laden and drawn by 6 horses. Macmillan highlights the demanding nature of this job, requiring dependability, high dexterity, sustained attention, foresight, and self-control, as well as the ability to navigate crowded and treacherous roads. He also had to learn the local language and customs and deal with political upheavals. These facts fly in the face of claims about his reduced capacities. So, why is Gage still so widely referenced as the archetypal case of disinhibition, despite the weak evidence? To truly understand the problem with the disinhibition narrative, we need to introduce our second historical figure, Edward Muybridge. He was a contemporary of Gage, also lived in San Francisco for a time, and also sustained a brain injury in an accident. In 1860, Muybridge, then 30, was on a stagecoach journey when the brake failed. He was thrown out, and 2 other passengers were killed. He reported a period of unconsciousness, amnesia, double vision, loss of smell and taste, and confused ideas that lasted for months. After he returned to California in 1867, Muybridge's friends noted a significant change, saying he was not the same man in any respect. They described him as very eccentric, with odd ways and expression, and not so good a businessman. Some experts speculate his injury unveiled his artistic and inventive genius, spurring him to take copious nude images in defiance of cultural norms. Indeed, he transitioned from a bookseller to one of history's most influential photographers, credited with pioneering motion studies. But here's the crucial difference and the uncomfortable truth. We know with great confidence that Muybridge did something terrible after his accident, something both violent and criminal, for which he was tried but not convicted. In 1874, he murdered his wife's lover. So, why isn't Muybridge alongside Gage in neuropsychology textbooks or Wikipedia articles about frontal lobe function? Given his documented brain injury and his undeniable dramatic behavioral change? The simplest answer is that the testimonies about Muybridge's personality change, and the retrospective clinical assessments aren't believable. Many of these testimonies were given in support of an insanity plea by his defense counsel, hoping to save him from the death penalty. Can we really be sure his friends would have said the same things without the urgent stakes of a trial? Even if we accept the testimonies as truth, the jury rejected the insanity plea. They acquitted him not because he was insane, but because they believed it was a justifiable homicide committed by a sane person. Muybridge himself stated in a newspaper interview, I objected to the plea of insanity because I thought a man to be crazy must not know what he was doing, and I knew what I was doing. I was beside myself with rage and indignation, and resolved to avenge my dishonor. His crime, as one biographer notes, was not an act of impulse, but a carefully laid plan. The rich historical record about Muybridge prevents us from simply explaining away his motives through disinhibition. He was clearly irascible, but he's remembered as a genius and innovator who existed with contradictory aspects: alienation and independence, masterful clarity in his work, alongside emotional overwhelm in his personal life. No one characteristic is taken as dominant or final. The historical record tells us he killed because he wanted to, out of anger, humiliation, and complex emotional reasons. This leads us to a critical point. The complexity of Muybridge's record prevents reductive interpretation, while, as Malcolm Macmillan states, the very slightness of reliable fact, which allows myths about Phineas Gage to flourish. But there's another powerful force at play: the relative social standing of the two men. Muybridge's work as an artist and his status seem to have acted as a shield against criticism and reductive interpretation. When his human nudes were published, a specially formed Muybridge Commission at the University of Pennsylvania, led by authoritative figures, deliberately attached a scientific-sounding name, animal locomotion, and a prohibitively high price to the publication. This ensured only wealthy, upper-class individuals and members of institutions would have immediate access. They even got influential people like former U.S. President Rutherford B. Hayes and Thomas Edison to subscribe. As art historian Sarah Gordon puts it, they relied on their social status and on the public's uncritical trust in professionals to shield images of the nude body from moral scrutiny. The same forces of social status and uncritical trust that benefited Muybridge did the opposite for Gage. Gage had friends and was employed, and there's no primary source suggestion he was isolated. However, without powerful friends to defend him, the story told by Harlow after Gage's death was treated as fair game by commentators with their own professional agendas. This comparison illustrates a core problem with the idea of social disinhibition. It relies on the highly variable interpretation of what constitutes appropriate behavior. The jury at Muybridge's trial, explicitly recruited to represent the community's ethical priorities, believed it was appropriate for him to kill his wife's lover. He wasn't just acquitted. He was celebrated by a cheering crowd. This demonstrates how unpredictable morality is. Appropriate behavior isn't maintained by an individual brain alone. It's produced collectively through continual negotiation. That's why we have legal systems. Even among those who accept the revised Gage story, the consensus is that his character probably did change, but that any disinhibition was likely temporary. But we need to challenge even this. What else could provoke such a temporary change? Psychological trauma is a huge factor. Imagine surviving an accident like Gage's, losing an eye, losing your job, and not feeling aggrieved and confused for a while. That's an unrealistic expectation. Research shows that survivors of life-changing injuries report profound impacts on their attitudes, regardless of neurological consequences. My former colleague Callum, who first got me thinking about this, shared his own experience after brain injury. He doesn't remember the first 10 days, but friends told him about funny, wild things, he said, like suggesting they smoke a joint in front of his family. Later, he'd wheel himself out of the hospital against doctors' orders. The first example was likely during post-traumatic amnesia. The second, after his amnesia ended, could have been labeled disinhibition, inconvenient behavior that makes life hard for staff. But Callum emphasized that while these behaviors were out of character, they still held meaning. The wild things reassured his family that he was still the same person, remembering his friends. And disobeying doctors? He insisted it still belonged to him rather than to some mysterious new identity unveiled by the injury. He said, "I'm not a different person. I'm me after something traumatic has happened to my brain. It was still me doing those things. It was me who was disinhibited." He even said it held value. "I did it because it made me feel good. It was a way of proving to myself that I could do things. Maybe on some biological level, I had to be that brave and confident because I was going through something so enormous." This was the first time I encountered an explanation of disinhibition that treats it as purposeful for the person as necessary, rather than just a symptom to be suppressed. This aligns with figures like neurologist Kurt Goldstein, who believed injured individuals' behavior always strives towards self-actualization. We'll never know how Gage might have interpreted his own behavior, but getting his story straight still matters because the myths about him can stigmatize patients and families, even leading to a self-fulfilling prophecy where people are excluded as hopeless cases. Brain sciences have a vital role in formulating descriptions that help people understand what has happened to them, illuminate the path to self-knowledge and self-compassion, and provide coping strategies. But for this to be helpful, the descriptions must reflect human experience, not just dramatic images that support a favored theory. We have very little written by Gage himself and no archive of his creations. But we do have 2 photographs, identified in 2009 and 2010, which are our closest thing to a first-person testimony. In these pictures, Gage appears upright, clean-shaven, neatly dressed, with a steady expression and a firm grip on his tamping iron. His left eyelid is closed, showing his lost sight. But other signs of injury are hard to detect. He looks determined to make a good impression, someone who cares about himself and the experiences he creates for others. These are in stark contrast to the Gothic monster often imagined in the literature. The stories about Gage and theories of frontal lobe function tell us a lot about our beliefs in morality and free will. But they are not truly scientific. They're drawn from spiritual beliefs, superstitions, and even pseudosciences like phrenology. They reinforce ancient, hierarchical metaphors of the human soul. As neurologist and psychiatrist Edward Huey suggested in 2020, disinhibition became widespread because it was compatible with strongly held cultural beliefs about the importance of inhibiting inherent drives and desires. It remained popular due to its intuitive appeal and simplicity. But it's this very simplicity that should make us discard it now. The theory of disinhibition has been overextended. It is used to explain so much that is now poorly defined and vague. Huey argues for a wider, more tailored approach instead of one single theory. Phineas Gage deserves a better legacy. As commentators noted in 2018, he might be more important for demonstrating the possibility of functional recovery after severe traumatic brain damage. The pursuit of simple explanations in psychology often stems from wishful thinking. If we stop thinking of the brain like a Rubik's Cube, perhaps we can appreciate what's truly iconic about Gage. That he survived, both as a body and a person. We should remember him as someone who rescued dignity from catastrophic circumstances, achieved self-reliance and meaningful connection without professional rehabilitation against extraordinary odds. And if we want to improve our theories about brain injury, it would be far better to develop them in partnership with living brain injury survivors, rather than solely relying on the lives of those long departed. This might be more time-consuming, and the results may not be free of contradiction. But that's people for you. They don't always make sense. So, what's the takeaway from all of this? The next time you hear the story of Phineas Gage, remember that the truth is far more complex and far more inspiring than the simplified, sensationalized version. Remember that human behavior, especially after trauma, is multifaceted and influenced by countless factors beyond just a localized brain injury. This conversation isn't just academic. It affects how we perceive and support individuals living with brain injuries today. By challenging these outdated and often harmful narratives, we can foster a more compassionate and effective approach to care and understanding. What are your thoughts on the myth of disinhibition? Have you encountered similar oversimplifications in other areas? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspectives. If you found this video insightful, please give it a thumbs up and share it with someone who might benefit from this discussion. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.